Today on the City Steading Brews Fermenstation, let's talk about headspace and oxygen in your brew. Is it good? Is it bad? Or does it even matter?
You got the announcer voice going hardcore today.
Hey, you know, if I can do one thing well, I will focus on that one thing.
All right.
By the way, I'm Brian.
I'm Derica.
And this is the Fermenstation, the podcast for City Steading Brews. And we are coming to you from our new studio, in quotes. I can't, this is a podcast, so I can't use my hands as much, but it in quotes.
This is our temporary space because our permanent space is still under construction.
Yeah. We don't really like shooting in this particular situation because it's a little bit weird.
Particularly the table that's in front of us that you can't see if you're not watching.
But also, it might sound great to you, but to us, all we hear is echo and reverb.
Echo.
So this is basically an empty room at this point, other than the bookshelves of mystery behind us. But anyway, today we're talking about headspace and oxygenation in homebrew. Now, let's talk about the terminology first.
Yeah, we get a lot of hate and people saying, no, sir.
It's correction. I wouldn't call it hate.
Wrong. So we did some research, and Brian actually wrote down the actual definitions of these words.
Very short, 3 to 4 word definitions. So the words are oxidize, oxygenate, and aerate. Now, I was always saying we aerate our brew in the beginning of making it to get more oxygen into it. And in actuality, that's wrong because aerate is for circulation, like you aerate your lawn or you aerate a liquid to help its circulation and flow. So it's not necessarily the action, it's the use case that makes the difference there. And then we say oxygenate, or, well, yeah, oxygenate, I guess, is the second word that we would say. That means to enrich with oxygen. So technically, when we say we're aerating the brew, we're oxygenating the brew.
Right.
Now, I know there's a scientist out there that corrected me on this once. He was actually quite nice about it, and he explained the differences, and I couldn't find his post. But he went into detail on what they all mean, and it really came down to nuance and subtlety. But he made it more clear. It seemed a lot more clear-cut the way he did it. But anyway, I would say most of what we do is oxygenating. And then you have oxidize. That means for something to be combined with oxygen. Now, my understanding would be oxygenating is intentionally adding oxygen to enrich it with oxygen, like in the beginning of a brew, where oxidizing is the chemical change that happens when it physically combines with the oxygen. And for homebrew, it's usually a non-desirable thing.
Right.
So I think that would be the best way to see it. And if someone ever gave you crap for using the wrong word, just blame me. I'm okay with that. I mean, here's the thing. Nobody's going to correct you because most people probably use these words wrong or interchangeably too. And unless you have a YouTube channel, you'd never know the difference because no one would tell you. But if you do have a YouTube channel, they will tell you. Trust me.
So I think what we intend to be using in this particular podcast is the oxidation.
Yeah, oxidation or oxidizing or oxidization. Believe it or not, they're all the versions of the same word. I actually looked that up a long time ago.
Yeah, when you have to think that hard about the words that you're saying.
Oh, yeah.
It's really annoying, but
Yeah,
hey, it's part of our responsibility.
So the first thing that we want to talk about, though, after getting the term straight, is headspace would be the next term that we want to talk about. And what is headspace?
Headspace is basically the void in whatever vessel your liquid is that isn't liquid.
Exactly. Yeah. It's the distance from the top of your liquid to the edge of the vessel where it would be, you know, a lid or something like that. And if you don't have a lid, then you actually technically have infinite headspace, I guess.
Ooh.
Never thought about it that way, but that's kind of what it is. And there's a lot of talk about headspace, and I think much of it is a little bit overblown, but it is something to be aware of. And when I say be aware, you want to have as little headspace as possible once alcohol is present, okay? But see, there's so much more to this though, because headspace is a good thing at one point and a bad thing afterwards.
Sure. So near the end of the fermentation process, typically in secondary fermentation, this is when headspace becomes more of concern as it being a potential bad thing.
Right.
And lots of people freak out. They're like, oh, I have 2 inches. Just take a deep breath, relax, and
Woosah.
look at at your vessel, typically we are looking at going above the shoulder. And the shoulder is the area where the vessel curves and starts to taper towards the neck. If you're using a wide mouth fermentation vessel, there's going to be a very short distance between that shoulder and the lid. If you're using a typical 1 gallon carboy, then it
tapers really fast.
It tapers really fast, but then there's a length of neck. Yep. So any area above that shoulder where it starts to taper and curve, in our viewpoint, that's basically where you want to be.
Be safe. Yeah. And, here's the thing. It's kind of like the law of diminishing returns. After the shoulder, we find you're probably not going to have a problem. But if you can be all the way right up to the tippy top, that's supposedly better. You're minimizing risk. That's all this really is you're just minimizing risk. Does this mean that if you have almost zero headspace versus 2 or 3 inches of headspace, that one is guaranteed to oxidize and the other one is guaranteed not to?
Nope.
No, there's no guarantees here, because you can oxidize in any situation if there is exposure to air at all. And that's the thing. I don't like to put too fine a point on it and scare people, but I want to put it enough that you say, okay, if I can improve the headspace or reduce the headspace, then that's a good thing. But too much is still too much. And that's just it. There's no answer for how much is too much. But before we go much further there, I want to explain what we were saying about headspace can be a good thing too. When you first create a brew, when you're in the fermentation process, a lot of headspace is helpful, and here's why. A, it does give some exposure to oxygen, but B, it gives room for expansion, because during fermentation, as most of you know, a lot of bubbles, gases, and just general nastiness is produced, especially the first few days.
Yeah, there's a lot of activity going on. At least that's what you're hoping for.
So if you have space between your brew and the top of your vessel, you don't have to worry about that mess being on your counter or your floor or wherever you might store your brews. So we've started doing that, where we use a 2-gallon bucket to make a 1-gallon batch on purpose. So we have 1 extra gallon of space, but that is only for primary fermentation. Once primary fermentation is done, we do not want that much headspace ever again on top of that brew.
Another point about headspace that I didn't clarify enough when I was talking about the shoulder is that what you're actually looking for isn't the volume of air in your vessel, but the volume of surface area between your liquid and air. So that's why going above the shoulder where it starts getting narrower is going to limit the surface area.
Right, because below the shoulder, it's generally a cylinder. So it's going to be all the same amount of surface to air ratio. Whereas as it goes up and it gets narrower and narrower and narrower, you have less and less and less compared to the area of the liquid versus the area of the air. I hope that makes sense. And if we didn't explain it correctly, I'm sure someone will tell us what we said wrong. 90% of this comes from our understanding and our experiences of doing this. There are real scientists and real experts out there that, hey, I appreciate when they tell me this isn't actually the way this works or something like that. And I do a little bit of research just to check them out too and make sure that what they're saying is right. And hey, if they're right, you know what? We admit it and we move on. That's how science works. You believe a thing until that thing is proven wrong. And then you take that new thing and you use that until that is then proven wrong. And then you find a new thing and you work with that until that is proven wrong, and so on and so on and so on. That's why it looks like science is always changing its mind. It's not. It's growing. It's learning and refining its ideas. So we try to do the same thing.
So now that we define the terms of headspace and all the oxygen-related words, let's talk about the comparison. And what does headspace relate to any of those oxidize, oxygenate, and aerate words?
Well, the more headspace you have, the more contact you have with oxygen, the greater your chance of oxidizing your brew. And that's not always a desirable thing. In fact, usually it's not desirable. People talk about micro-oxidizing, and corks can do this over a long period of time. They allow in a certain amount of air to touch the wine or mead or whatever happens to be in there. And it's such a small amount that it takes many years of contact to really make much difference. And that's considered micro-oxidizing. But what happens is when that oxygen is in contact with the wine, it can change it. Sherry is a good example of an intentionally oxidized product. For wines and meads, it's not always something you really want. It is a flavor component that you can play with. We really haven't done a lot intentionally oxidizing, and even accidentally oxidizing. I think we've only had it happen like once.
We did once, and that was because it was after everything was done. It has been in a bottle for years, and we just drank a little bit at a time, and it was a really large bottle. So there ended up being a significant amount of headspace left.
See, I'm thinking this must have happened twice then, because I have a different memory of it.
For like years.
We left it on the shelf, a partial bottle, for at least 6 months, and it tasted flat.
It got a little funky. Yeah.
It looked weird too.
It wasn't a pleasant experience.
No.
And that is what you're trying to avoid by limiting your headspace and by minimizing any oxidization. Did I say it right? Oxidizing.
Oxidization or oxygenation or oxidation. See, it's just so confusing.
I think the oxidize.
I think it's oxidizing is the negative thing.
Yeah.
Oxygenating is the positive thing. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. I'm going to go with that. And aerating is for your lawn.
All right. So we kind of briefly touched on it, but how easy or difficult is it to oxidize a brew? And is this really something that we need to be so stressed out about?
Well, here's the thing. I've never tried to oxygenate one on purpose, or I've never tried to oxidize one on purpose. So I don't know how easy it is to do, but I do know that in our experience, even with all the weird ways that we do things, it's never happened.
Yeah.
Except that time that we had a half open bottle that we left on a shelf for months.
Yeah, and honestly, neither one of us were surprised that occurred.
No.
Basically, at that
surprised
instance,
it took that long.
Yeah, at that point, if you have that much of volume, invite some friends over and just finish that bottle. So that way you don't have to worry about it.
I mean, I know it's a thing like wine connoisseurs and people like that will say that if you open a bottle of wine, you have to finish it within 24 hours or 2 days or 3 days or it goes bad. Well, they're talking about oxidizing. We've actually not seen that. I've left open bottles of mead for several days, not open, but like it was open and then I reclosed it. And it was fine.
Typically, we keep them in the refrigerator. And I don't know if refrigeration
it slows the process.
If it slows it down, oxidation.
It apparently does, because that's what they say to do is, once you open it, keep it in the fridge.
All right.
Some wines and things like that, you don't necessarily want to refrigerate, but I'd rather refrigerate it than let it oxidize.
Yeah.
But it's just one of those things, like I hear about this all the time, yet I rarely actually hear from someone who it happened to. And that is something really important, because one thing I'd like to get across is it's not just our experiences that we're talking about when we do things like this. I am talking about ours, our admins who we're very close to. Most of them are like our best friends at this point. Our VIPs that we're very close to. We hear from them all the time. And all of you, our viewers. I'm the one that reads all the comments, and I really do read all the comments, and I try to respond to as much as I possibly can. And I hear about people being afraid of oxidizing, and I hear about someone saying, oh, it turned to vinegar, when in fact, I don't think it turned to vinegar, but that's not oxidizing. Mm-mm. Oxidizing can cause it to turn to vinegar under certain conditions, and I'll talk about that in just a second. Remind me to talk about that.
I want to get into.
But in general, I don't hear about someone saying, oh, my brew got oxidized and tastes bad now, or tastes flat, or they don't say that. And I'm talking about, we get anywhere from 20 to 50 comments every single day for the last 7 years. We have thousands upon thousands upon thousands of comments, mostly from new homebrewers or inexperienced homebrewers. So I would have expected a lot more talk about oxidation based on how much hype it gets all over the internet and in instruction manuals and everything else. Now, I'm not saying don't worry about it and disregard and use whatever you want. I'm just saying it is something to be aware of, but don't let it rule your life.
Yeah.
Because too many people are paranoid about, the least little bit of headspace because they're afraid it's going to oxidize their brew. Now, I'm sure someone, because we've now said this, is going to tell me that they oxidize their brew, and I wouldn't be surprised. I'm sure it happens. We've never experienced it from that perspective. And like I said, I've not heard anybody really say it. And most of those that said it were actually saying something else. They thought they did, but it was actually something else.
Yep.
Now, the thing that you were going to remind me of, vinegar.
Vinegar.
This is a downside of oxidation that you might notice rather quickly. I think regular oxidation, where it changes the flavor of a brew, takes a long time. It takes months and months and months before it really makes it bad to drink. I mean, that's what it took for us. Now,
so let's start off with what are the parameters in order to make vinegar in the first place?
Okay, let's even back it up a little bit more.
Sure.
When you first make up a brew, you are adding some oxygen to that brew, and Headspace is a good thing. Okay, so you basically just have sugars, simplified version. You have sugars, yeast, and liquid. Okay, over time, what's going to happen is the yeast are going to convert those sugars into alcohol and CO2 once the oxygen has been depleted by the yeast in building up the colony, because that's what they do. They use up the oxygen that's there, build their colony, make it nice and strong, and then they get to work converting into alcohol. At this point is when you don't want to introduce more oxygen, because there's something else that's going to be there. Derek likes to say they're omnipresent, and this is true. It's kind of like yeast, and it's called acetobacter. An acetobacter is what makes acetic acid, which is also known as vinegar, okay? But acetobacter needs something that should not be there anymore in order to make vinegar. They need alcohol for one, and they need oxygen. So essentially, when there's no alcohol, now you want the oxygen and the yeast can get to work. Once they start producing alcohol, you don't want oxygen anymore, because then you can activate the acetobacters, which will start turning your alcohol into vinegar. Now, acetobacters do have some limitations, and that is up to about 10% ABV, they can do some conversion with diminishing results. Past 10%, it gets harder for them, and at about 15% ABV, they pretty much can't produce vinegar anymore. So every once in a while when somebody says, I made an 18% mead and it turned to vinegar, well, I don't think so. I think something else happened. And I usually try to delve deeper, and usually it turns out it wasn't vinegar at all. It just was a flavor they didn't like. It was very dry. But we talked about that in a different podcast, didn't we? I think just last week.
We did.
So that's the basic relationship with yeast, oxygen, CO2, and acetobacters and alcohol. It's like this fine balance that happens throughout the fermentation process. And that's why it's a little confusing, because adding oxygen and having a lot of headspace is good, but then at other times it's bad. And then you want to prevent it once this happens and start it when this happens. It gets really confusing, and I can totally understand why somebody new to brewing would get very confused by that, because we get it all the time. Somebody will say, isn't that too much headspace? And they mean in primary fermentation. Nothing to worry about in primary fermentation. I could put a quart of brew in a 5-gallon fermenter, and it's totally fine for primary fermentation. It's stupid, but it's totally fine for primary fermentation.
And I think that about covers it. We've talked about what Headspace is and gave you in-depth description, so that way you can determine on your particular vessel how much Headspace is good or bad. We've talked about when Headspace is good to have and when Headspace is bad to have. We've talked about all the different definitions of the oxygen words and how they are confusing, and we apologize for any misusage we've done in the past.
One thing we didn't talk about is how to reduce headspace.
Oh, sure.
If you want to have less headspace.
All right.
As you were saying that, I thought of that, something more we could talk about.
So let's say you didn't rack to our favorite pitcher with the raised numbers on it, so that way you didn't know what your volume was before you racked into your new vessel for primary or for secondary fermentation.
Or conditioning phases, I like to call it.
Right. And so, you have too much headspace. Well, what do? You can either re-rack it into a smaller vessel if you have one available, or if you don't, you can carefully add something to the brew that you can sanitize. So I'm not suggesting you add more liquid, because then you're going to change the composition of your brew, and you don't want to do that.
Right. That's a common question. People ask, can I add water or can I do that? You're just going to dilute it, and that would change your brew. So we're talking about ways to do it without changing the brew, just adding something.
So one item that you can use are lead-free glass marbles. You want to find food-grade marbles. I'm finding it more and more difficult to locate those.
Yeah.
But if you can find them and put them in a bag, like a brew bag, so you
Yep.
can sanitize the whole thing and then let them drip dry and then add them to your brew. You can do that. You just want to be really careful that you don't dump
Drop them in.
something
Yeah,
in there
they can
because you could
shatter.
possibly
Yeah.
break your vessel, and that would be really sad.
Another thing that you could use instead of that, if you're using a wide mouth vessel, is like fermentation weights.
Yep.
Because those are food grade.
Yep.
So if you sanitize that, you can put that into the bottom of the vessel and that will raise the level and you can put in as many as you need. But what we like to do, we actually like to just have a bunch of different size vessels. We actually have, we have at least one 5-gallon fermenter. We
Yep.
almost never use
We have
it.
a 5, we have a 3, we have lots of 2s, we have
Yep,
tons
we have
of
2-gallon
1
buckets.
gallons.
We have 5-liter vessels,
Right,
which is just a
right.
little bit more than a gallon.
That's true.
We have 1 gallon. We have 3/4 gallon.
We have half
And we have
gallons.
half gallon. So that way we can just keep scaling down the fermenter size as we rack and need more space. But Derica said something very important. How do you know what size vessel you need? Well, that's where the pitcher comes in. Now, this is a double-edged sword using this pitcher for this purpose because it now means you have to rack twice. Okay, because you're going to put it into the pitcher to measure, and then you're going to rack it from the pitcher into the next vessel. So some people don't like to do that, and I can totally understand. The more you rack, the more chance you have of adding that oxygen into your brew and causing oxidation problems down the road. So what we tend to do is I just got really good at eyeballing it. And I kind of know, like from our narrow mouth 1 gallon to a wide mouth, there's a little bit of a difference. It's like about 0.1 to 0.2 gallon difference. So if it's going from a narrow mouth 1 gallon, we can go to a wide mouth 1 gallon. From a wide mouth 1 gallon, I might go down to 3/4 gallon. From 3/4 gallon, I might go down to half a gallon. Or sometimes we just run the risk. We have left more headspace than we wanted to several times. And I forget we did it, and it's never been an issue. We've not had a problem. I mean, it could happen. Don't get me wrong. It is a calculated risk, just like everything that you do in homebrew. There's always, yes, that's the right thing to do, but there's always a but everywhere, or an except, or in this case, or it depends. There's always that in homebrew. And that's part of what makes it fun, part of what makes it infuriating at times too, because there's always a plus and a minus to every single thing you do. So you just have to decide what's the best for me and what's the best for my situation and what do I feel like doing? How much effort do I want to put in? Because, you know, I'm kind of a lazy homebrewer, I'll be honest. Even though we keep a lot of things going and all that kind of thing, as far as the brewing goes, I like to mix it up and let it ride. I don't want to have to babysit it. I don't want to have to check it every 15 seconds to make sure that it chewed up this much sugar or that much sugar. I want it to just ferment.
So what Brian was talking about, and before he continues, because he will, it reminded me of another thing that we didn't talk about in regards to this specific topic. And
perfect.
that's how can you oxygenate a brew? We focused on headspace because that was our main topic. But when Brian talked about racking, that reminded me of different ways that you could possibly oxidize your brew. And so basically, anytime you're transferring your liquid to another vessel, that is an opportunity to have an oxidizing event.
Right.
So that's why we're really careful, and we use the auto siphon because it mitigates any oxygen coming into contact with our brew.
Right.
We're really careful that the end of our tube goes to the very end of our new vessel, so that way we don't have the liquid flowing through air.
We're not creating a waterfall.
Right, because that's bad. That's also why we don't just pour from one vessel to another,
Right.
because all that space is going to be a point that you could possibly oxidize something. If you've noticed, every time we take a measurement and we reintroduce that measurement sample back into our brew, we tilt the vessel that we're brewing in and run the liquid down the sides. That way we're mitigating, again, its exposure to oxygen.
Right. Essentially, it comes down to surface area again, just like we talked about earlier. When you have a long stream of liquid going through air, there's a lot of surface area that can come in contact with the air around it or the oxygen. So by having the tube all the way at the bottom of the vessel or by pouring gently down the side, we're really reducing the amount of surface area that it has to be exposed to the oxygen.
This is also one of the big reasons why we don't recommend filtering brews, because doing a
Well,
homemade,
okay, it depends on the filter.
sure, but like a homemade pour it through a coffee filter
no,
thing.
that's bad. That's
it's-
bad.
That's
That's a
just
bad
an oxygenation or oxidizing mess waiting to happen.
Yeah, the professional level filters and even like the ones made for homebrew, that's a whole different thing. It's a closed system. They're
Yeah.
not exposing to
Yeah.
oxygen. I mean, there is some risk just because you are moving the liquid, but it's much, much, much less than just say pouring it through a coffee filter, which doesn't even work. Just so you're aware, it doesn't really remove things. It removes the big stuff.
Yeah.
But you're much better off using like a tea strainer or like a rumble jar or
Rumble
something
jar.
and racking from that. That way you're keeping all the solids behind and you're getting the clear liquid or cleanish liquid to go through your auto siphon instead, because it's also not good for auto siphons to get all that gunk up inside them.
Yep.
It breaks the seals.
Yep. Is there any other ways you can think of?
Oh, I can think of a million things to talk about, but
No, in this topic, oxidizing a brew.
I think we've covered it fairly well.
Okay.
If you do have any questions about Headspace or oxidization or oxygenation of your brew, please leave a comment below and I'll be happy to answer it as best I can. If I don't know the answer, I usually do look them up. I don't
Yep.
just say, oh, I don't know, can't help you. I actually look things up and do the research. And we love that because this way we learn more as well as being able to have more information to share back with you. So it all comes around and, just makes everything better. But as always, guys, thanks so much for listening and have a great day.
Bye-bye.